Cecil John Rhodes was born middle class in 1853 in England. However, Rhodes would prove anything but an English gentleman. At a time when honor and honesty were supposedly classed gentlemanly traits, Rhodes used deceit, violence, and fraud in the name of the British Crown, all to accomplish his grand imperial dreams. Rhodes believed with all his might that the British were the master race and hoped to expand their domination from Cape to Cairo. 17-year-old Rhodes migrated to South Africa with £3,000 in his pocket. There, he ran his brother's farm in Natal before joining him in the diamond fields of Kimberley. His family's capital would multiply into a fortune so vast that Rhodes could successfully colonize and name entire countries after himself. The British South Africa Company, combined with Rhodes's greed, deception, and bigotry, would lead him to engineer the end of the great dynasty of the Matebele Kingdom. Welcome to Village TV as we tell the story of theft in Africa by Cecil John Rhodes. A theft so grand and vast in scale, it still today haunts governments and institutions throughout Southern Africa. His father was Francis William Rhodes. Francis William came from a wealthy family who held numerous business interests. He was educated at Harrow and Trinity College, Cambridge. After university at Cambridge, it was naturally assumed that Francis William would either join the family's real estate or brick manufacturing concerns. Instead, he chose to take holy orders, starting his career in the church as curate of a small parish church in Brentwood, Essex, built, it is said, at his own expense. Francis William would remain as curate of this small parish church for 15 years until he became the vicar of Bishop Stopford, where he remained until 1876. Cecil John Rhodes was born on the 5th of July, 1853, in the small hamlet of Bishop Stopford, England. He was the fifth son of Francis William and his second wife, Louisa Peacock. Rhodes had 9 brothers and 2 sisters and attended the local grammar school at Bishop Stopford. Growing up, young Cecil read voraciously but vicariously. His favorite book was The Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, but he equally adored the highly esteemed historian Edward Gibbon and his works on the great Roman Empire. As a teenager, Cecil suffered from terrible asthma and a possible cardiac problem. When he was 17 years old and hoping to improve his health, his father sent him to join his brother Herbert, who was cotton farming in Natal, South Africa. His father reasoned the warmer climate and business opportunities offered in South Africa would provide young Cecil a more promising future than staying in England. Young Cecil set sail on the Eudora from Gravesend, England in the summer of 1870. He had with him £3,000 sterling, capital that had been loaned to him by an aunt as he ventured to the colonies to seek his fortune. His destination, the British Crown colony of Natal, South Africa. Unbeknownst to all, was just how this feeble and sickly looking teenager would change the world we live in. The young Cecil John Rhodes set foot on African soil for the first time on the 1st of September 1870, disembarking in the early afternoon at Durban Bay in the then British Crown colony of Natal. By the time Rhodes arrived at the farm, his brother had already left to travel 650 kilometers north to the diamond fields in Kimberley. Left on his own, Rhodes began to work his brother's farm, proving himself to be an astute businessman despite his young age. In October 1871, Rhodes left the Natal colony to follow his brother to the diamond fields of Kimberley. In Kimberley, Cecil's quarter claim and one of Herbert's 2 claims were very profitable. However, the haphazard nature of the diggings were dangerous and could not be worked at all during the rainy season. Seeing an opportunity, Rhodes imported steam-operated pumps to keep the diggings dry. He then obtained contracts to service 3 of the largest mines in the diamond field. He will prove very enterprising, introducing new mining methods in working diamond claims, dealing in diamonds, operating the only ice-making machinery that supplied ice to miners in the hot Kimberley sun. Other enterprises included wire rope manufacturing, insurance agent, and a wine and cigar merchant. When Herbert suddenly left in November 1871, the young Cecil had a chance to show his maturity with full control over all their claims. By 1872, approximately 50,000 men had encamped in the Kimberley Diamond Fields area. Tents were replaced by corrugated iron and mud brick houses, rudimentary hotels, bars, brothels, banks, stores, a church, a school, the famed Kimberley Club, and the Stock Exchange. In 1872, and after establishing himself, Rhodes met Charles Donnell Rudd, and they became firm friends and partners. Rudd studied at Harrow, where he won the mile and kept wicket. He attended university at Trinity College, Cambridge, where he excelled in playing rackets. In the early 1870s, he worked for his brother Thomas's Port Elizabeth-based trading firm. By 1873, Rhodes had assets worth over £10,000, enabling him to leave to study in Oxford. He entrusted his claims to his new partner Rudd and sailed to England. In 1873, Rhodes returned to England to complete his studies. He was admitted to Oriel College, Oxford, but only stayed for one term in 1873, later returning for a second term in 1876. In 1870, art critic, social reformer, and professor of fine art at Oxford, John Ruskin, made a speech which would resonate and reinforce Cecil John Rhodes' own attachment to British imperialism. In his speech, John Ruskin announced a new role for empire. He introduced the theme of imperial duty as Britain's destiny and how Britain had a mission to found colonies and settle them with young men who would advance the power of the home country. In Ruskin's own words, there is a destiny now possible for us, the highest ever set before a nation. This is what England must do or perish. She must found colonies as fast and as far she is able, formed of our most energetic and worthiest men, seizing every bit of fruitful waste ground she can set her foot on, and there teaching these her colonists that their chief virtue is to be fidelity to their country, and their first aim is to advance the power of England. What Ruskin was doing was to introduce a new ideology for empire and adding a new justification for the annexation of new territories. Rhodes was often quoted describing a desire to paint the map red, referring to the red used in maps to denote the British Empire, and his ultimate dream to build a railroad from Cape to Cairo. Cecil John Rhodes would define his radical vision of the cause, bringing of the whole civilized world under British rule, for the recovery of the United States, for the making of the Anglo-Saxon race into one empire. Before his departure for Oxford, Rhodes had realized that the changing laws in the Kimberley area would force the small man out of the diamond fields and would only leave larger companies able to operate in the mines. In light of this, he sought to consolidate a number of mines with his partner Charles Rudd. Rhodes further speculated and decided to move away from the New Rush Kimberley minefields, where diamond deposits lay higher in the ground and were more accessible, back to the lower yielding Old Rush area, where even richer diamond deposits lay deeper in the ground. Here, Rhodes and Rudd bought the costly claim of what was known as Old De Beers, which owed its name to Johannes Nicholas de Beer and his brother Diedrich Arnoldus de Beer, the original owners of the farm Vrouwtech. It was this farm that would later lend its name to Rhodes and Rudd's ever-growing diamond company. In 1874 and 1875, the diamond fields were in the grip of depression, but Rhodes and Rudd were among those who stayed to consolidate their interests. To permanently keep the price of diamonds high, the supply had to be limited, and Rhodes believed this was possible if he had full control over all the mines in Kimberley. Rhodes had come to the realization that the only way to avoid the cyclical boom and bust of the diamond industry was to have far greater control over the production and distribution of diamonds. And so, in April 1888, in search of an oligopoly over diamond production, Rhodes and Rudd launched the De Beers Consolidated Mines Mining Company. With £200,000 capital, the company, of which Rhodes was secretary, plotted to expand the business and amalgamate all 622 registered claims in the region under De Beers Mining Company. Rhodes's main competitor in gaining full control over the diamond industry was Barney Bonato, owner of the Kimberley Central Diamond Mining Company, the largest company in Kimberley. In 1888, Rhodes and Bonato began the fight for control in earnest. Initially, Bonato had the upper hand, or so he thought. Bonato had bought up 4 claims in the center of the Kimberley mine and prospered so that he was able to form the Bonato Diamond Mining Company. He kept on buying up claims, and in 1885 he merged his Banato Diamond Mining Company with that of Baring Golds to form the Kimberley Central Diamond Mining Company and set up offices in Stockdale Street. Cecil John Rhodes was actively buying up claims at the same time. Since his company was going so well, Banato saw no reason to join any scheme of Rhodes's for amalgamation. However, one obstacle lay in the path of the Kimberley Central Diamond Mining Company, namely Compagnie Française de Dumont du Cap, known locally as the French Company, owned by a wealthy Parisian diamond dealer, Mr. Jules Porges. By virtue of its position within the Kimberley mine and the policy it pursued, the French company impeded any success of future operations by Banato's Kimberley Central. Consequently, Banato made proposals to the French, but Rhodes had beaten him to it, and further, he had succeeded in raising the finance necessary for the purchase of the French company in Paris. Rhodes then laid a trap for his rival. He told Banato that he could acquire the French company if he wanted it, and he would not ask for cash in payment, only the equivalent in Kimberley Central's recently issued shares. By this means, Rhodes was able to secure a foothold in the form of 1/5 of Kimberley Central's capital. The stage was now set, and a titanic battle for the remainder of Kimberley Central's shares ensued. Both Rhodes and Banato bought recklessly, and at a time when the price of diamonds barely covered the cost of production, the company's shares soared from 14 to 49 pounds within a few months. Legend has it that after a weary 28 hours of negotiations in Rhodes' boardroom, he suddenly produced a bucket heaped with diamonds. "Sign, Barney, and it's all yours," Rhodes is reported to have said. "You can't whip me with bribes," Banato replied, "but you have your fancy, as other men have theirs, and I see that I shall have to give you the means to go north." And so, in March 1888, Banato surrendered his control of the Kimberley Central Diamond Mining Company. And on the 13th of March 1888, De Beers Consolidated Mines Limited was formally incorporated. Rhodes wrote out a check for £5,338,650 for the assets of Kimberley Central, which in those days was the largest sum of money ever covered in a single check. £4 million of which went into the pockets of the Banato brothers. As part of the deal, Rhodes made Banato one of the 4 life governors, arranged for him to be elected as Kimberley's Member of Parliament in the Cape Assembly, and procured a membership to the exclusive Kimberley Club. Banato would remain as Member of Parliament for Kimberley from 1889 until his untimely death in 1897, reportedly committing suicide by jumping from a ship on the voyage back to England. His body was recovered and buried in Willesden Jewish Cemetery in London, England. In 1888, with Rhodes as its first chairman, and 17 years after his arrival at Durban Bay, De Beers Consolidated Mines Limited was born. Rhodes had successfully amalgamated and dominated all of South African diamond mining, 90% of global production at the time. Controlling 90% of the world's diamonds made Rhodes an incredibly rich man. However, Rhodes was not after wealth for wealth's sake. He was acutely aware of the relationship between money and power, and it was power he sought. In a conversation with Hans Saud, whilst overlooking Kimberley diamond mines, Saud asked Rhodes, "What do you see here?" With a slow sweep of his hands, Rhodes answered with the single word, "Power." After all, Rhodes's imperial vision for Africa was never far from his mind, and it was about to be laid bare for all the world to witness. Riding high on De Beers' success, and as foretold by Barney Banato during their negotiations, Rhodes looked northwards towards Matebeleland and Mashonaland in present-day Zimbabwe. Matebeleland fell squarely in the territory from the Cape to Cairo, which Rhodes hoped to conquer in the name of the British Empire. It was also believed to hold vast untapped gold fields, which his partner Rudd believed would be of far greater value than those discovered in the Witwatersrand. In 1887, while Rhodes was consolidating, the Matebele King Lobengula signed a treaty with the Transvaal government, Dutch Boer settlers who colonized the Eastern Cape. This act convinced Rhodes the Boers were trying to steal his north. The scramble for Africa dominated the 1880s. And after the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, Rhodes became convinced that the Germans, French, and Portuguese were all going to try to take Matebele land. As a result, Rhodes decided to mobilize quickly and get Matebele land under British control. The British government officially opposed further colonial expansion north of South Africa. However, Rhodes deviously painted the threat of other imperial powers like Germany taking over the land to push the British government into action. In response, the government sent John Smith Moffat, the assistant commissioner to Sir Sidney Shepherd in Bechuanaland, to negotiate a treaty. The result was the Moffat Treaty of February 1888, a relaxed protection treaty between Lobengula and the British government. Rhodes found himself an irrelevant player in this arrangement. This, despite his initial encouragement for the government to get involved in Matebeleland. Rhodes was desperate for exclusive mining rights in the region and worried the Moffat Treaty was too weak to hold Matebeleland. Convinced the Dutch and Germans were making plans to take the territory, Rhodes concocted his own plan to take control. With his partner Charles Donnell Rudd, Cecil John Rhodes formed the British South Africa Company. Patterned after the British and Dutch East India Companies, it was a commercial political entity. The British South Africa Company's purpose was exploiting economic resources and political power to advance British finance capital. In March 1888, Rhodes sent Rudd to Lobengula with a contract granting exclusive mining concessions to the British South Africa Company. When Rudd arrived at Lobengula's kraal, however, there were numerous British concession hunters already there, plotting the same maneuver. Offering protection against the Dutch, other Europeans, or even local enemies gave the British South Africa Company the edge. Rudd was able to get Lobengula to sign a concession giving exclusive mining rights to the British South Africa Company in exchange for protection against the Boer and other neighboring tribes. The young warriors of Matebeleland were rightfully angry and were itching to attack the white men who entered and occupied their land. Preferring peace, King Lobengula feared his people would be defeated if they attacked the whites. He likely signed the Rudd concession in hopes that British protection would prevent Boer migration into Matebeleland, which would incite his warriors to battle. King Lobengula's options were severely limited. Concede to the British or take the chance of war with Dutch settlers. Seemingly more lenient and liberal, the king chose the British, believing he was protecting both his subjects and kingdom's interests. Using the Rudd concession, despite initial resistance by the British government, Rhodes managed to acquire a royal charter for his British South Africa Company on the 29th of October 1889. The royal charter allowed Rhodes to act on behalf of the crown in Matebeleland. It gave the company full imperial and colonial powers, including to create a police force, fly its own flag, construct roads, railways, telegraphs, engage in mining operations, settle on acquired territories, and create financial institutions. Cecil John Rhodes would convince the British government to give his company the right to control parts of Matebeleland and Mashonaland deemed not in use and to provide protection for the African residents on land that would be reserved for them. This proposal, which would cost the British taxpayer nothing but would extend the reach and wealth of the British Empire, eventually found favor in London. For Rhodes, the British South Africa Company, with its royal charter, was his means to expand the British Empire, something a timid government and penurious treasury were not about to accomplish. After gaining his charter from the British government, Rhodes and his British South Africa Company partners felt that Matebeleland and Mashonaland were under their control. In Rhodes's view, war with the Ndebele was inevitable, and he would not allow his dream of empire to be thwarted by a savage chief with about 8,000 warriors. Cecil John Rhodes was determined that white settlers would soon occupy both Matebeleland and Mashonaland, and further, to ensure the Ndebele could not resist them. To gain power over Matebeleland and Mashonaland, Rhodes hired mercenaries, Major Frank Johnson, Major Maurice Heaney, and Frederick Courtney Selous, a hunter with professed close knowledge of Mashonaland, to raise a force of 5,000 white men. Major Frank Johnson had promised to deliver to Rhodes the Ndebele and Shona territories in only 9 months for £87,500. Rhodes advised Johnson to select the sons of wealthy and influential families as recruits, in hopes that if the attack failed and the British South Africa Company force was captured, the government would have no choice but to send troops into Matebele land to rescue the sons of Britain's elite. Rhodes called off Johnson's attack after receiving news that King Lobengula would allow British South Africa Company miners into Matebele land and Mashonaland without any opposition. Despite King Lobengula giving his permission for hundreds of British South Africa Company miners to enter his territory, Rhodes double-crossed him with a new plan to eliminate any chance of resistance. And so, on the 26th of June 1890, an invasion force of 300 policemen and almost 200 pioneers marched north across the Macloutsy River from Bechuanaland to Mount Hampton, 640 kilometers away. This was the Pioneer Column, dressed in military uniforms, brown corduroy riding breeches, leather leggings, army boots, and broad-brimmed hats with one side turned up. They were well armed with Martini Henry rifles, Webley revolvers, Maxim machine guns, and artillery. The pioneers had been selected from over 2,000 applicants in South Africa for their technical skills, riding, and shooting ability. Mechanics, farmers, butchers, bakers, and a large group of prospectors were lured by tales of an El Dorado with vast gold fields just north of the colony. Members of the Pioneer Column had been promised a salary of 7 shillings 6 pence a day, and by Major Frank Johnson, 15 claims in the gold fields and 3,000 acres of prime freehold farmland in Mashonaland each, a staggering total of almost 1 million acres. Rhodes's ploy was to put the king between a rock and a hard place, to either attack the settlers and be crushed, or allow a vast military force to take seat in his country. In the words of Rutherford Harris, one of Rhodes's associates, "If he attacks us, he is doomed. If he does not, his fangs will be drawn, and the pressure of civilization on all his border will press more and more heavily upon him, and the desired result, the disappearance of the Matebele as a power, if delayed, is yet the more certain. Gentlemen." On their march north, the column built 3 forts at Tule, Victoria, and Charter. They also built post stations every 25 to 35 kilometers of the journey between Bechuanaland and Mount Hampton in Mashonaland, where they arrived on the 12th of September 1890. The next day, on the 13th of September 1890, on parade, a young lieutenant, Edward Tyndale Biscoe, hoisted the Union Jack. A 21-gun salute was fired, and 3 cheers were given for the Queen, proclaiming the land beneath their feet British territory. The site was to later become the town of Salisbury, present-day Harare. Rhodes's British South Africa Company invaded and occupied present-day Harare without any resistance from King Lobengula. Salisbury became the base of white settler occupation in what became southern Rhodesia and later the independent nation of Zimbabwe. The prospectors of the group and the British South Africa Company holders hoped to find a second rand in the ancient gold mines of the Mashona, founders of Great Zimbabwe, a late Iron Age kingdom. But on arrival, they soon came to realize the gold had been worked out of the ground long before. With no gold to be seemingly found in Mashonaland, Rhodes's British South Africa Company was facing financial ruin. After failing to find El Dorado, Rhodes granted farming land to hundreds of settler pioneers, going expressly against the Rudd concession, and in so doing, Rhodes completely disregarded King Lobengula's mining concession and simply seized the land. In conceding exclusive mining rights to the British South Africa Company, King Lobengula had successfully avoided going to war over Mashonaland, kept his people alive and much of his territory intact. Unfortunately, this would not last long. Leander Starr Jemison, one of Rhodes's associates, suggested getting Matebele land open would give us a tremendous life in shares and everything else. Gaining Lobengula's territory would also play into Rhodes's megalomaniac vision of expanding the British Empire from Cape to Cairo. And so, in 1893, the British South Africa Company clashed with Ndebele, in what Rhodes had perceived as an inevitable war. The settlers justified their initial attacks against the Ndebele to the British government by arguing that they were protecting the Shona against the vicious and savage Ndebele impis. This was, however, a ploy creating the impression that the Ndebele were the first aggressors, consciously concocted by Jameson and Rhodes to ensure the British government would not object to their further intrusions into Matebele land. The final confirmation that the Ndebele could not avoid war came when Jameson was able to convince the British government that Lobengula had sent a massive impi of 7,000 men into Mashonaland. The British government then gave Jameson permission to engage in defensive tactics. There is no indication that the impi Jameson reported on ever existed. Lobengula himself, in a last appeal to the legal, rational system the British seemed so fervently to uphold, wrote to the British High Commissioner saying the following: "Every day I hear from you reports which are nothing but lies. I am tired of hearing nothing but lies. What impi of mine have you people seen, and where do they come from? I know nothing of them." It was, however, far too late for King Lobengula. With permission to engage in defensive action, Rhodes had joined Jameson in Matebele land, and his group of mercenary soldiers struck a quick and fatal blow. Cecil John Rhodes's mercenaries were in possession of the latest in munitions technology, carrying with them into the veldt Maxim guns, which, like machine guns, could fire rapid rounds. The Ndebele impis were helpless in the face of this brutal killing technology and were slaughtered in their thousands. King Lobengula realized he could not hope to face the British in open combat, and so he burned down his own capital and fled with a few warriors. Pursued and under duress, the king is presumed to have died shortly afterwards in January 1894 from ill health. The war against the Matebele, fought mostly by voluntary mercenaries, cost around £66,000. Most of the money to pay for this war came directly from Rhodes's Consolidated Goldfields Company, which by this point had begun to produce excellent yields from the deeper lying gold seams. The conquered lands were named the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland. They included Southern Rhodesia and Northern Rhodesia, named in the honor of Cecil John Rhodes, and Nyasaland. Today, these countries are the independent republics of Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Malawi.